Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and we are live at 83weeks.com. And of course, it's a whole lot more fun when we're joined by the Hall of Famer himself, the man who single handedly beat Vince McMahon 83 weeks in a row, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Eric Bischoff. Eric, how are you, man?
Doing great. Doing great. Enjoying a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Got to catch a little bit of football this afternoon. Spent some time outside. Wonderful day. And I get to do this. So all is good in the kingdom.
All is great here in Florida as well, and we are excited to be breaking down episode 5 of Mr. McMahon. We are live, so if you've got a question about the episode or pretty much any question you'd like to ask Eric, this is your chance. We'll be monitoring the live chat, looking for those questions, so keep them coming, and if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn the notifications bell on. We're going to be going live tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. And boy, it's going to be a big one. We're going to be talking about episode 6 of the Mr. McMahon documentary, which does cover more current events. But episode 5, man, we're picking up from the Owen tragedy and we're off to the races. And we run into a little bit of legal talk on this episode. So I thought, hey, why don't we call our resident expert, friend of the show, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gimmick Attorney himself, Mr. Mike Dockins. Mike, how are you, man?
I'm good, buddy. How are you guys?
Man, we're excited to have you on. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to jump on with us. But before we went live here today, Mr. Bischoff made note of, Mike, are you in a comic book store or where are you? Let's go to a one shot of Mike so everybody can see that background. Where are you, Mike?
I am in the law firm of Shoemaker, Lupin, Kendrick in my office here. This is, in fact, a law firm. And as I was explaining to Eric, when I got into doing legal work for wrestlers, I thought, man, this is so cool. And I've got really cool clients who have done really cool things. I'm probably the coolest in the firm. What can I do to kind of show that off? And I thought, there's some people that have really fun clients, but how many have been made into action figures? So I thought I'm going to get an action figure for anybody I do legal work for, get it signed. I'm going to put it up in my office. And so this is a portion of all of those things. So now my office is a stop on the tour. Everybody, even people I'll probably never meet again or ever do legal work for, they stop into my office to check it out.
That's really cool. That? What a great idea.
Well, let's jump right into it. I guess I first should ask, Mike, did you binge all of these episodes at the same time like almost everyone did?
I did it in 2 waves, so not all of them at one time, but I did binge 2 and 3 episodes at a time.
Well, we're going to sort of start from the beginning of the episode here in episode 5. And as a reminder, we've just finished the conversation in episode 4 about the Owen Hart tragedy. But when we open episode 5, we start to hear from Paul Heyman, where he's talking about the tragedy of the Vince McMahon story is that he spent the rest of his life trying to rebel against the first miserable 12 years of his life. And there's been a lot of discussion about Vince's childhood, and there's even been mentions of the Playboy interview, but seemingly nobody ever wants to highlight the Playboy interview from 2001. We actually have a couple of screen grabs here that I sent over to Dave Silva. I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to cover where Vince talked about his childhood. He says, in regards to sexual abuse and molestation, it's not anything I would like to embellish just because it was weird. Playboy asked, does it come from the same man? Talking about his stepfather. And Vince says, no, it wasn't. It wasn't from the male. And Playboy says, that's so mysterious. It sounds like a difficult thing to deal with. And McMahon says, I'm not big on excuses. When I hear people from the projects or anywhere else blame their actions on the way they grew up, I think it's a crock of shit. You can rise above it. The country gives you opportunity if you want to take it, so don't blame your environment. I look down on people who use their environment as a crutch. And he would continue as the Playboy interview followed up. We can leave that topic, but one thing first. You said that the sexual abuse in your childhood wasn't from the male. It's well known that you're estranged from your mother. Have we found the reason? And it's written in the interview here that McMahon pauses and nods before saying, without saying that, I'd say that's pretty close. And Eric, we've talked a little bit about this topic before. And I know there's going to be a big topic in episode 6 when we get to the more current developments from 2024 and all the details that we've learned. And while nobody ever just outright says anything in the documentary, this interview is referenced. So it's not exactly a secret. I mean, this has been out there for the world to see for 23 years. And not that we're here to sort of excuse or explain away or whatever for Vince. But when you read his words there in that interview from 23 years ago, it does start to give you a sense of maybe how he became the Vince McMahon that we know now. Are you surprised that this was even discussed, even in passing on the documentary? It feels like that would be something that people would want to keep way under wraps.
No, I'm not surprised. As I mentioned in one of the reviews that we did, I have a friend who knows some people in the documentary business, and even before Vince did the deal with Bill Simmons and the team that he worked with, ultimately, there were other people who Vince interviewed, and one of them relayed a story to a good friend of mine, and I heard it from him. So this is officially third-hand information. Therefore, it doesn't really mean anything. But it's interesting in this context because, from what I was told, Vince was so open about this subject in particular that it caught these producers by surprise. They didn't even know how to react, and they were shocked that this was something that Vince wanted to discuss. Now, Vince went with another production company, the one that we're seeing now. But having heard that back in 2000, whenever I heard it, 2019, 2020, probably 2020. No, this content doesn't surprise me at all.
The other thing I want to mention is the Playboy interview does discuss physical abuse, and I think this leaves a few more clues about who Vince is and why he is. Playboy would ask, excuse me, back in 2001, "You lived with an older brother, your mother, and occasional others, right?" And McMahon said, "My parents got divorced, and I went with my mom, Vicky. She was in the church choir, a real performer, a female Elmer Gantry, very striking, with an excellent voice. Lived with her and my real asshole of a stepfather, a man who enjoyed kicking people around." Playboy would ask, "Your stepfather beat you?" And Vince would nod and say, "Leo Lupton. It's unfortunate that he died before I could kill him. I would have enjoyed that. Not that he didn't have some redeeming qualities. He was an athlete, great at any sport, which I admired. And I still remember watching the Jackie Gleason show with him. We used to laugh together at Jackie Gleason." Playboy would ask, "Lupton was an electrician. He hit you with tools, didn't he? A pipe, a wrench?" And McMahon says, "Sure." Boy, this is just brutal. And sometimes through the course of storytelling, and certainly in professional wrestling, Eric, we see people maybe embellish. And I could see how, if you didn't know all these details, when we opened with this very dramatic part of episode 5, where Paul is sort of painting the picture, Paul Heyman that is, that Vince just spent the rest of his life trying to overcome what happened to him in the first 12 years. But boy, with the context of that Playboy interview, it feels like we learn a lot more about maybe the way Vince is, the way he is. But Leo Lupton is a name that we don't hear very often. I don't think it's been said outside of that interview. Can you add any color to what we've shared here today about this Playboy interview with Vince McMahon?
Well, first I want to note that opening dialogue narrative with Paul Heyman was powerful as hell.
Yes.
Paul is amazing. I don't know that anybody could have delivered those thoughts with as artfully and powerfully, frankly, as Paul Heyman did. There's a reason Paul Heyman's in the position that he's in, and we got a close look at it right there. But I insight, no. Does it really give me pause and make me think? Because so much of what, and even before the controversy, the civil suit and all the drama that we've heard about and is in the news, I've always wondered, like many people, what made Vince McMahon tick. Because to be honest with you, I don't know. I've never met anybody that could possibly have done what Vince McMahon did for the wrestling industry. I don't think I've ever met anybody that was more intense, more focused, more committed, but yet so difficult to understand. And it's interesting to hear Vince say, well, I don't like, I have no respect for people that, make excuses for their environment or the way they grew up. And I'm sure that maybe is in Vince's mind a badge of honor for him or something that he's proud of, that he was able to overcome that, and rightfully so. But I wonder if he really understands the damage, the kind of psychological damage that children, particularly at such young ages, 6, 8, 10, 12, at any age, but that age is such an important age. And to go through, even if he embellished half of it, there's still a lot of hot mustard on that sandwich. And what he went through, again, even if only half of it is true, is you can understand why the adult may be carrying around some baggage that he doesn't quite understand, or in some cases she.
It's noted in this. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I think your comment about Paul and what he had to say to start the show, it just is it's such a great demonstration of how well Paul understands people and the human condition and why he's so good at what he does and what he does as a character. There's a saying, right? Everybody here has probably heard it: hurt people hurt people. Or sometimes you'll hear it say abused people abuse people. And so I think it provides a lot of insight into what Vince has done and why he's done it.
I mean, it's one of the mysteries, and when I said he's such a hard guy to read, that's one of the challenges I had when I went to work for Vince in 2019. I don't know what Vince's expectations were. Frankly, we never even discussed it. It was a non-interview interview. I had no idea what his expectations were or what he really wanted me to focus on. I think in retrospect, Vince wanted me to come in with a Vince McMahon type approach and just grab everything by the balls and start squeezing until something good came out. That sounded weird, but just pressuring the people around me and forcing change for the sake of change, just to see what I had in my tank. And that was really the way I operated, for the majority of my career, especially in management. I was very aggressive. I was probably in some cases pretty hard on the people around me and expected them to be as committed to my ideas and my vision as I was. So I get that. But when I got to WWE, I made up my mind that I wanted to approach business a little bit differently, and I wanted to get a lay of the land. I wanted to get a feel for the people around me. I wanted to understand what my writing team, even though I never knew who was on my team, but I wanted to know what their strengths were, what their weaknesses were, what they were particularly good at, and maybe somebody else is better at other aspects of writing, so that you can kind of coalesce a team that you can really manage and work with. And that takes time. And I think Vince wanted another Vince. He wanted somebody to come in and shake things up. And I remember spending so many times talking to my wife during that brief 4-month period, is I just can't read this guy. I cannot get a read on him. And not to put myself over, if I have any natural talent whatsoever, and arguably it's limited, but I think at the top of the list is my ability to generally be pretty good at reading people. It's one of the reasons I was able to manage up the way I did in Turner. And I've always been able to do that my whole life. I've always been able to manage up really well because I was good at reading people. Not 100% of the time, but often. And I would often be correct. With Vince, I got no read. He's so protective and defensive. When I say defensive, not outwardly, the way you would normally expect someone to be defensive, but like there's this force field around him that is impenetrable in terms of getting to know who he really is. And it's I love this episode more than I thought I would. I watched it, a couple of days ago, and I went back and rewatched it this afternoon before the show. And this one is kind of similar to episode 4, where yesterday I said, man, we got a couple glimpses, almost like little snapshots of what makes Vince McMahon tick. This episode gave us a little more of that, and I enjoyed it as a result.
Heyman sort of lays the groundwork at the beginning of the episode where he says escaping that abuse has been Vince's life pursuit. He wanted to become untouchable and invulnerable to outside sources. He wanted to control his own destiny. And I think that is pretty apparent. Doc, not to put you on the spot, but you've seen a lot of WWE contracts, I'm sure.
I have.
Vince McMahon, if anything else, he has always made sure he was untouchable, invulnerable to outside sources, and controlling his own destiny, even down to something as silly as talent contracts, right?
Yeah, these contracts, I mean, they're 20 plus 28 pages, 30 pages long usually. And in being in negotiations for those contracts, there's about two things you can negotiate, maybe three. Kind of depends on where you are on the card, but money and dates and travel. And that's about it. Everything else is very much pro WWE in WWE's control.
We hear from Vince right before the show opens, and he says he hates looking backwards, and it's not because, or he's not sure if it's because he's afraid to look back there. Quote, "My childhood was what it was," and he mentions that there was fighting, infighting, and even incest, but he felt like when the abuse was finished, if he was still breathing, then he won. So just throw it the fuck back there and keep going. Get rid of it. Like this whole moving forward, there is no rear view mirror. What's best for business? Like that sounds like the Mr. McMahon character, but this is actually real Vince that we're hearing from here, Eric.
It is, and it's not just hyperbole or putting himself over, or maybe because I don't know that would get him over if people would find that an admirable quality. But it's so consistent if you look back over the years in the decisions that Vince has made. Quite frankly, the decision to bring me in as a talent back in 2001 or whenever it was, the Warrior, to bring him back, to bring Sable back. We saw that in detail. I mean, it was weird. Stephanie's using it as part of a promo about Sable, suing WWE for sexual assault. Now it's part of a storyline. Vince has demonstrated exactly what he said in this documentary. He doesn't look backwards. He only looks forwards, and it is good for business. Let's talk. So it's not just Vince saying something to establish his character for this documentary. So much of what he's done throughout his career demonstrates that that's truly what he believes and how he thinks.
Dawkins, next up, we're going to see a little bit of footage of both Shane and Stephanie McMahon, and we see, old archival footage of them, and then of course we see present day, and we're hearing Shane talk about how he was trying to pay his dues and work his way up. He wanted to do everything in the company and learn everything, whether it was taking ring jackets or helping set up the ring or even being a referee, whatever it is. And then of course he became an on-screen character, and he was sort of on your way to get to the big boss, Vince McMahon. You had to beat up his son, Shane. I think Shane is one of the more interesting interviews throughout this entire documentary. And I think some of that is because we routinely hear from Stephanie and Vince and Hunter. Even if we don't hear from them in a quote unquote shoot capacity, we at least have some more familiarity with them present day than we do Shane. But I think the Shane stuff, and that's really what we're going to be talking about a lot here on episode 5. I, as a wrestling fan, just assumed he was the heir apparent. Dawkins, we're about the same age. When you were growing up, didn't you just assume one day Vince would hand this business off to Shane? I mean, I just think back to that WrestleMania 20 opening where we see Vince holding Shane's baby. It just feels like, oh man, this is a family business. It's going to Shane next. Did you have that assumption?
I did, and I really feel for Shane in all the interviews. I've never met him, never talked to him, but it seems as though he probably had a pretty good childhood, very well adjusted, but he saw the path he was going to take over for his dad, and it was going to be very cutthroat. It would have to reflect what his father had done to his dad to get into the business, to take it over, and I don't think he was prepared for that. And I don't think he was prepared to behave that way and be that cutthroat, because he seems like such a good wholesome guy, family guy, always talking about his kids and his wife. And the poor guy just never had a chance. But I'm with you. I thought he was going to be the heir apparent. It was going to go from father to son to grandson.
It's interesting to take a look at what really happens. Of course, we know on camera Stephanie McMahon would become a character for television. She'd obviously grown up backstage in the business, but now she, like her brother Shane, is going to find herself in front of the camera. In storyline, of course, she's with Test. And during the wedding, we all know what happens. Triple H slides in, and now that's going to begin a whole new storyline. And life starts to imitate art. These guys get together in real life. And even though Vince had always said, oh, you can't date one of the wrestlers, ultimately, he's the one who sort of pushes them together. You need a real man like Triple H. I found that whole conversation about don't date a wrestler, well, this one's okay, interesting from Vince. Eric, you're a dad. You know all these players. What'd you make of that? That Vince may have been the guy who helped push together Hunter and Steph way back when.
I love this part of the story. And again, I didn't pay close enough attention the first time I saw it. But one of the, again, I sometimes refer to him as pivot points. But if you look at Paul Levesque's career trajectory and where he is today, and Paul said it, the story, the writers had written a story about Vince or about Stephanie getting married to Tess, right? But they didn't have a finish. They didn't have an ending.
Yeah.
They couldn't finish Act 3. So it was open-ended. And Paul Levesque picks up the phone and says, hey, Vince, I've got an idea. Had those writers, and this is another one of those what-if scenarios, what would have changed throughout the entire company and its current trajectory had Paul not picked up the phone and said, hey, I got an idea how to finish this? Because that changed everything. Paul obviously got close to Stephanie. They ended up getting married. They have children together. And I think Vince saw in Paul the son the person he wanted to run this company when he was gone, more so than Shane. But had Paul not picked up the phone, had he not had that idea to finish the story and take Stephanie off to Vegas, which, by the way, I wasn't watching WWE when all that went down. I'm going to go back and watch this shit because it was really awesome. Taking her through the drive-through, roofing her and all that. What a funny story. Well, it was funny to me. Probably, drugging somebody and roofing a woman to get her to marry is probably not palatable by today's standards, and nor should it be. But, it worked back then. But what a great story. What a great story. And how would the business have changed? Who would be running WWE right now if Paul hadn't picked up the phone with a finish to that story? So don't anybody ever tell me stories aren't important.
I mean, isn't that kind of the issue, Dockins? Like, if that angle doesn't happen, does Stephanie wind up marrying Hunter? Is there more room at the table for Shane? It's kind of weird, and it feels awkward to even discuss. But what do you think, Doc?
I think that angle gave Stephanie the opportunity to shine, right? It really gave her an opportunity to show what she had in her and how she could be as a character, but also how she would deal with the wranglings of dealing with writers, dealing with angles, dealing with wrestlers. And, I don't know Stephanie, but I get the impression that she's probably more like her dad than Shane is.
Oh, my God.
Can be
in
more
so
cutthroat.
many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, Doc, just to your point, yeah, it gave her an opportunity to shine, and she's a natural performer. She's so good.
Very good.
Just loved working with her. Other than Steve Austin and Mick Foley, there's nobody I enjoyed working with more. I had fun with Jonathan Coachman. I've had fun working with a lot of people, but Stephanie was so good to work with because she was zeroed in on her character and she knew how to play it. But was interesting. Now that was, I started working with her long after she made her first appearance as a talent. But even in this documentary, if you look at the progression of the things that she did, it's one thing to be able to memorize your lines. It's one thing to be able to go out there and create emotion and manipulate the audience into reacting the way you want them to. But a part of what it takes to get to that upper tier level, the Paul Heyman type level, he may be at the top, so I'm using his as the bar, but you have to be freaking fearless. I mean, emotionally fearless. I'm not talking about being willing to take bumps and all that stuff. That's a different conversation. But as a performer, to do some of the things that she did, particularly because she was the boss's daughter and she was young, she was fearless. She didn't second guess anything. And it comes across. You know, the narrative in the documentary supports it, obviously, and so did some of her sound bites. But she was just, as a performer, she was fearless, and it's one of many reasons why I respect her the way I do.
I got a question, if I can, kind of jump in real quick, because Eric has special knowledge in this area. How does the Vince and Shane dynamic kind of compare to maybe Vern and Greg? Are there any parallels there, personality wise?
There's parallels. I don't think it was as intense,
Of course.
but I think there's a lot of similarities. You know, I think Greg had a personality. Now, I don't want to suggest that I know Shane real well. I've worked with him. I've had fun with him. I've gone out drinking with him. Pretty superficial stuff in terms of really getting to know someone's psyche and who they really are. But I've always been of the impression, and you know, we've heard it from others who do know Shane much better. He's a very lighthearted, free-spirited. He likes to smile. He likes to have fun. He, as Conrad pointed out so clearly, and I think correctly yesterday, he's an adrenaline junkie. So he's always on the edge looking for something. He's always looking for a cliff to jump off of, figuratively and sometimes literally, if there's a ring involved. Greg was much that way. Greg was always the lighthearted one. Greg was, even when Greg tried to be tough, when I mean when he tried to be serious and try to, be intense, trying to get his point across, it's almost like he had a gleam in his eye and a half-ass smile on his face. You just never really took him. Now, Vern, on the other hand, different conversation, way different level of intensity. And I don't know that Vern ever, I don't even want to say this because it's so unfair. My impression, watching from the outside looking in, I don't think Vern had the respect, or Greg had Vern's respect to the degree that Greg was hoping for it and wanting it. I do think there's some parallels there. Good question.
Well, we want to hear those questions from you guys. If you've got a question for Mike Dockins, myself, or Eric Bischoff, hit us up. We're going to be answering your questions here live. And before we continue the conversation, our man Ant ran a poll, and he private messaged me here to say, to underline Conrad's point, 70% of our audience are saying they had never even heard of the Vince Playboy interview. When did you first hear about that interview, Eric? Is that something that was on your radar in 2001? Or was it years later?
Years later, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when I started working with Scott Silver on the Hulk Hogan script. Because Scott was doing a ton of research. He did so much research. I'm talking FBI agents, and I mean, it was crazy the amount of research he did. And that was one of the things that he found. And of course, when Scott found it, he brought it to my attention. And that was really the first time I heard about it. So I'm thinking maybe 2019, 2020.
What about you, Doc? Was this on your radar as a wrestling fan in 01, or when did you realize this?
I think I heard about it from you when you and I became friends 4 or 5 years ago, and then I went and looked into it. Like, how have I not heard of this? How do I not know about this? Fascinating.
Well, it is fascinating, and at the same time, pretty damn sad. And we're getting lots of questions like this, right or wrong. John Thompson wants to know. Question for Eric. What do you think about Vince's treatment towards Shane McMahon as he was growing up? Of course, you weren't there, but based on what we've seen, what you've heard, what would you imagine that Shane's childhood was like?
Look, I'm sure there are many aspects of it that were wonderful. I mean, look at the way Shane grew up. I'm sure there were many aspects of his life that was good, but you heard Shane in his own words, forget about my opinion, in Shane's own words, man, he grew up wanting his father's approval. And I think all of us do, right? I think that's probably the way it should be in the natural order of things. If your father is your role model and you grow up and aspire to be like your father or at the very least gain his approval. I think that's common amongst everybody. But I think with Vince, because he is such a hard nut to crack and so judicious with a slap on the back and a good word, that I can see how Shane grew up just pushing himself to get that attention. It's really clear to me there were aspects of Shane's life that were tough. That's a hard thing to go through, well into your adult life, and probably even to a degree to this day, feeling like you never really measured up. And you may not think of it that in those terms, but subconsciously you're carrying that bag of shit around with you for a long time.
He casts a wide shadow, a very large shadow. That's a hard one to
Yes.
step out from under. No matter how great Shane is or the great things that he does, that's a big shadow.
That's another good point, especially in the wrestling business. I mean, you talk about living up to expectations. Holy crap. Come on. You talked about that before, Eric Watts in WCW, Greg Gagne, Vern Gagne. There are some talents that obviously do well. Randy Orton, a perfect example. But, being a second generation wrestler and coming up and trying to fill your father's shoes, that's a whole nother kind of pressure.
Well, no pressure when we got Mike Dockins with us. Efren is with us here live, and he just wants everybody to know I love Dawkins. We love you too, Efren. Thanks
Love you
for
too,
joining
buddy.
and hopping on with us.
You know what? I
PJ
just want to
Tate.
say Efren's one of the coolest guys I've met. I've spent time with him at the ad-free shows things and Top Guy weekends and all that. Starcast, I see him a lot. But this last event that we did together, Top Guy weekend, I spent a little bit more time with him. What a wonderful, wonderful guy he is, and very talented, amazingly talented. He's so good at what he does.
He's the best. And if you're with us at adfreeshows.com and you've done a Top Guy weekend, you already know that. Shout out to Efren. Travis Medway says the documentary has been fine. If it had been a DVD release 15 years ago, it would be outstanding. But for us enlightened by deep dives like 83 Weeks, the bar is high now. Mr. McMahon plays a little like WWE history for dummies. Yeah, that's hard to disagree, Dawkins. I mean, you and I are way deep in the bubble. We're not casual fans at all. But I did feel like, man, if this came out in like 09, 05,
It'd be an
20 years
expose.
ago, boy,
Yeah.
this would have been wild. But now, given all the access that we've had through the different documentaries and shoot interviews, and certainly the plethora of books and podcasts, a lot of this is old hat for wrestling fans. But it's important to remind people, especially listening to this stream, that this wasn't made for us, right, Doc? This is for the casual Netflix viewer.
It wasn't, and it was for the casual Netflix viewer. Our friend Matt Cardona and his guys on his pod at the Major Pod were talking about it, and they were likening it to Matt, who's not a big sports guy, watching the Manti Te'o documentary.
Yeah.
And they were like, "You probably didn't even know that his girlfriend wasn't real." And he was like, "I didn't. I had no idea." Like that was this huge spoiler that it just blew his mind when he saw it. That's what they're going for here. They're going for those people who don't know all this, that aren't all in the weeds, because I promise you, are a lot of people shocked by what they're seeing.
Yeah, and I think even the Bill Simmons podcast that Super Dave Silva sent me to review a couple days ago, Bill Simmons was talking. I think it was Bill Simmons that was talking about it, and they addressed that very issue. They had to make a decision as to how they wanted to produce this thing. Did they want to produce it for the wrestling audience, many of whom do know these stories, or at least some of them, or do they produce it for the 100 million subscribers around the world? And they wanted to produce a documentary that would be entertaining and interesting for people who weren't like you guys, or obviously me, or someone that has been in the business before, that's heard a lot of these stories in the past. So I think they did a great, structurally speaking, in terms of the format, in terms of the editing and the emotion and the story that they brought out. I mean, technically speaking, I don't think I've seen a better documentary in a while. And maybe it's because of the subject matter. It interests me more than some, but wow, what a great documentary.
The choice
Eric, I don't mean to cut you off there, Doc, but I
right.
want to ask this before I forget. In regards to, was it for hardcores? Was it for casuals? There was one sort of glaring omission that I felt like should have been touched upon in this episode, if nowhere else. But I don't think we have even a mention of China in this thing. And I do think that's an important piece of the backstory and the family dynamic between Vince being China's boss, Joni Lauer's boss, and the way the whole Stephanie Hunter relationship came to be in the very beginning. And I also understand it's not really about her and them, it's about Vince. But considering how her life ended, I just assumed there would at least be a couple minutes on China. Do you think there's stuff on the cutting room floor about China, or did they just decide not enough Vince, we'll move on?
Was that for me or Dawkins?
You, Eric. I'm sorry.
I would assume that there is, but let's keep in mind, this is the hard part of this, right? Because we're seeing this documentary now post controversy, right? Post civil suit, post Janelle Grant, and all the drama and Vince resigning. Now we're finally looking at this thing. But this thing was started in 2019 or 2020, whatever it was, and many of the interviews recorded in 2021 before all of this happened. I don't think, and I say that because there's still a lot of, I said this yesterday, WWE corporate branding going on in this documentary. That's what it was intended to do prior to this controversy. And I think that subject is kind of off limits. It's awkward, I think, internally because of the way it all went down, and it's personal, and it's no place, it doesn't have any impact on the business. And I would imagine if there were questions asked, the answers or responses were probably very cut and dry and non-interesting or entertaining, because I do that myself. Sometimes you ask a question, you don't really want it to end up on screen, and you can answer it in a way that just isn't very interesting. And it more often than not ends up on the floor. And I'm guessing if anybody asks any questions about Paul's relationship with China or anything to do with it, it was probably intentionally responded to in a way that made sure it was going to get left alone because they didn't want it to be interesting. They didn't want to dig into it. That's a guess. Don't know it. But also, it doesn't really have anything to do with Vince. It really doesn't have anything to do with the trajectory of WWE. So maybe they didn't even ask. It's hard to say. It's certainly not suggesting it's not an important piece of business, but talents breaking up is not exactly interesting documentary material.
I'm not as interested in talking about talents breaking up as I am talents breaking up and then one of the talents not getting another contract. Like the idea that, okay, well, now that Hunter is with Stephanie, what do we do with China? What we don't do is give her a new $1 million contract. And I know JR has said on his podcast, she asked for $1 million and we didn't think she was worth that. I get that. I don't know that I totally buy that, though. It does feel like it wouldn't have been a stretch that in that era, as hot as wrestling was, she couldn't have gotten close to that. They just abandoned it. And we know what happened with her life. I do think it was pertinent to the Vince story because Vince could have paid her $1 million. It chose not to. And let's move on as we want to talk more about this relationship, because this relationship with Hunter, Stephanie, and Vince is a little weird because they're going to be playing television characters, but they're also together in real life. And there would be a segment where the entire crowd, and again, this is the late 90s and early 2000s here, starts chanting that Stephanie is a slut. Can't believe that's a thing that happened at a wrestling show, but it did. And Vince, hearing this chant, allegedly says something like, "This is money." And it's a unique circumstance when you can have 10 or perhaps 20,000 people chanting that your daughter is a slut, and you're like, yes, this is the desired result. That's one of the more fascinating things in wrestling, is it not, Doc, that we want people to say horrible things like that? It means something's working.
This is why we love wrestling, right? Silly things like this. What's intriguing about that is that he was glad it was his daughter taking the abuse, right? I don't, even being in character, even all of that, I don't think I'd want to subject my daughter to that. But it was good TV. She was a great character. She was somebody I love to hate, and I think Eric would agree with that. That she was somebody that, when she was in that mode, was somebody people love to hate, and she just they all embraced it.
It was funny when Paul was recounting that story about when Stephanie walked out there and the crowd started chanting "slut, slut, slut." The way Paul described it, he looked over at Vince, and Vince went like that. Yeah. I've seen that. I know that's true. I know that recall of that moment, I believe that 100% because I've seen that. Vince doesn't say a lot when he's sitting in a gorilla. Sometimes, again, hard to read. There could be something really great going on inside of the ring, knocking out of the park. Stone face. Just looking at the monitor. Something could go wrong. Now, he gets a little more animated when it's a production issue. There were times when I've heard him screaming and hollering over the headsets at the truck. But for the most part, you can't really read him too much. And every once in a while, when something's good, he does that. So I got a kick out of that just because I've seen it.
Let's talk a little bit about the wedding, because here's a fun story that I'd never heard before. When these guys decide to go off and get married, Vince says, "Boy, what about putting this on pay-per-view? How many fans would pay to see Stephanie McMahon marry Triple H?" And of course, Stephanie shuts that down. Eric, are you even remotely surprised that Vince liked the idea of them getting married on
No, but
pay-per-view?
I love that. I mean, I loved it. I thought that was a great story. I could see how that happens. I could see it. It's a family full of performers, for crying out loud. It's a
And
modern
as
day
if that's
version of the Ringling Family of
It's
Barnum and Bailey. It's come on. Why would you not put it on pay-per-view?
it's the carniest
If
of
I
carny
was in that
moves.
role, if my daughter came to me, I'd obviously I would do it. But even if she didn't, I'd throw it out there. If she was a character on TV, absolutely I would, especially if her significant other was as well. Makes sense.
Hey, I wanted to ask you, Doc, about the uh, the story, and this is the first time I've heard this. After Stephanie shuts down putting the wedding on pay per view, perhaps as punishment, it's not explicitly said that, but perhaps as punishment, he books himself in a street fight against his own daughter on pay per view. And it's positioned as if you're not going to let me put your pay per view on wedding, the one I've got to pay for, I'm going to beat your ass on pay per view. Now, of course, some of that's in character, I'm sure. But this is a fun line in here as we hear that Linda put her foot down and says, "If she gets one bruise or anything happens to her to mess up this wedding, I'm filing divorce." This feels like a sitcom, doesn't it, Doc?
It does. It does. You know, the feeling I'm getting from this whole documentary and everything there, and we've even seen some comments here, people that are watching with us. You know, have they gone through therapy? Do they need therapy? I feel like a lot of these storylines are Vince's therapy. That's he's dealing with some feelings. He's dealing with things that have happened in his past. And he's dealing with it in the best way he knows how. Let's make it a story. Let's normalize it. Let's do something silly. My daughter frustrated me. She angered me. Let's make it a storyline where I get to maybe vent some of that frustration.
I don't think you're wrong, man. Whether he knows it or not, I think
Yes.
you're on the money.
It's a fucking cool story, and it's one of the nicer, more fun stories we get about the McMahons, because so much about the McMahons is going to skew negative in this. And as silly and stupid and over the top as it is, this to me feels like one of the more heartwarming McMahon family stories of the whole shooting match. Don't you think, Eric?
It's so lighthearted. I mean,
Yes.
your initial reaction was right on the money. It's like a scene out of a sitcom.
Yes.
It's like a story out of a sitcom. I mean, this would be a whole story. You could just see this. It's just so crazy, but in a fun way.
We know that the kids are going to become very popular characters. They've got Dave Meltzer here talking about how great Shane and Stephanie did, and the way it was positioned in sort of real life company corporate structure. Vince was the boss and Linda was the second boss. The idea being Linda will handle more of the business stuff and Vince will handle more of the wrestling stuff. And Vince actually says it was his mother who introduced the two of them, that Linda had come from an upper middle class family, and Vince liked that because we know what his family dynamic was like. And Vinda liked that Vince was known as a bad boy. He had a bit of a reputation as a fighter and so forth. They're going to marry young, and Vince promises her that he would always love her and there would never be a dull moment. And he says he's lived up to that promise. And I really liked this. It's a nice bright spot. We know there's going to be some sadness and some stress and some fractured business, family business here, but the love story of Linda meeting Vince when she's just 13 and he's only 16. And I know it's a different kind of relationship, but that they're still technically legally married today. Boy, that says a lot in the wrestling business, doesn't it, Eric?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It also says a lot for maintaining your property and your wealth and tax situation and all kinds of other things. It just seems like it's a marriage of convenience from the outside looking in, and I could be dead wrong. I hope that I am actually, but to me, it's given everything that's happened over the years, not just recently, but over the years. somebody made a decision that it would be wiser from a business perspective to stay married than it would be not to.
I'm fascinated with the whole Linda Vince relationship, and I don't think Linda gets enough flowers. I mean, goodness gracious, that woman's been put through the paces over the years. I mean, you can only imagine the things that people would say when the product is controversial, her husband's on trial for his life, the business is in the toilet. Now he's pulling the nose up on the thing, but now here comes all the parent teacher councils. I mean, it's just been one hit after another along the way, and she supported Vince. But one thing that they don't spend very much time talking about, that I was, in hindsight, that was pretty cool of Vince. He spent a fortune on Linda's campaigns twice. Uh, have you ever spent any time talking to anybody who was around in that era to really figure out what the heck was going on with those campaigns, Eric?
I never have. Never have. To me, it just looked like this is, Linda had supported Vince for so long and stuck with him through some pretty tough times, professionally and personally. And this was Linda's passion, and this was Vince's chance to return the favor, so to speak. That was always my impression.
And the idea that she did that after some of the crazy things that happened on TV, we should talk about that, because Linda does become a character on TV. And Vince would even say she wasn't a good actress, but she knew it. And Linda would say that she wasn't very comfortable on camera. It was better for Vince and Stephanie and Shane. And then Trish comes in to add some color to the way wrestling was back then. And, well, the first job of women in WWE back then was sex appeal. And we cut to footage where we see Trish grabbing Vince's ass, and now they're going to start some sort of a relationship in front of his wheelchair-bound wife. I mean, I'm sure if you're an outsider looking in, this all reads horribly, and certainly it's less than ideal. But that was like part and parcel for the Mr. McMahon character back then. But given what we know now, boy, some of these clips of making Trish bark like a dog and doing all of this in front of his wife, this really is going to play poorly with current circumstances. Don't you think, Eric?
Yeah, I think so. But Doc would have a better feel for this from a legal perspective than I. But my God, I mean, that kind of stuff in front of a jury, I don't know, man. And I get now, I said this yesterday and I thought about it after we finished up the show. I guess I've been looking at this documentary purely as an historical document on Vince McMahon and a little bit of an insight into Vince. I haven't been looking at it through the prism of, I wonder how this is going to affect his current situation legally. But after, thinking about it last night, so much of this stuff is going to be so hard to get away from. And some of it's devastating. And Doc, like I said, I don't know how much of it could be used, if it could not be used. I don't know. I'd like to hear from Doc on that one, but some of this is not going to play well.
Yeah, Doc, the barking on all fours. I mean, that's the clip you don't want a jury to see, right?
Yeah, that Vince's team is going to say that's highly prejudicial and it has no probative value, right? It has no value because that's Vince McMahon, the character, not Vince McMahon, the real human. What the other side's going to say, what the government's going to say, or the plaintiff in this case, they're going to say, no, we're going to bring up all these character witnesses, all these people that have talked about Vince, that know Vince, that have worked with Vince. You're going to see that Mr. McMahon, the character, is actually Vince McMahon, the human. And because the two are so inextricably intertwined, these things that you see on TV, that's a reflection of the real Vince. That's a reflection of the real human that does these real things, that does these degrading things. Will they be successful? I doubt it. Not to bring up Gawker and all of that, but when Hulk had his thing with Gawker, he's like, look, I'm Terry. I'm not Hulk. Hulk is different. Hulk has this person and this, these characteristics and these traits and these whatever. Terry's a different person. I'm a totally different human than that. So I don't think they'll be successful in it, but boy, I'd try if I were them.
Will they be able to enter any of the clips or any of the stuff from the documentary into evidence?
They could try. But again, I think there'd be an objection to say this is just, if we were doing a trial of Brad Pitt, would we bring up his character in Fight Club, that he goes out and beats up people and gets beat up and laughs? And it's we're not the same person. Brad Pitt is a real human who pays taxes and does all these things. That's a character. So unless they can get that line blurred where they're able to show there's actual value in showing these things he did as a character, because it's not really a character, that's the real human, I think the chances are pretty slim they get it in.
So let me, not to dig into the proceeding too far, what hasn't happened yet, but just in terms of how things work, would that objection take place in front of a jury, or is that something that would that evidence be ruled on outside of a jury trial?
It could be done in a preliminary hearing. They oftentimes you will have certain evidence that people are going to bring up. It depends on the judge as to what they're going to say or do. I had a trial where we had all this outside third party evidence and we objected to it in the preliminary hearing. And we were pretty confident that our objection was valid, that this should not be brought into trial. It should not be brought up. And the judge looked at us. He goes, "That's going to make a great objection at trial," and just moved on. And so it could be either way, Eric. They could try to do it in the preliminary hearing and get it knocked out so that it never ever comes up and gets shown up. Or it might just happen at trial. But as they try to introduce the evidence, right, you can't just all of a sudden play a video and nobody knows. They're going to have to provide some basis for it, where it came from, all these authentication sorts of things. And maybe even if they just get a few seconds into it and don't show the whole clip, there will be an objection. It'll get stopped and there will be a ruling on that objection.
And this trial will probably, I'm sure.
Well, hang on, Eric. There's not going to be a trial.
No, there you go.
I mean, I know we're talking about hypothetical and a jury and all that. Before we get too far down this hypothetical fantasy thing, there's not a criminal file that's been done here. This is a civil suit, and I understand that there's probably going to be some sort of arbitration, or I would imagine a settlement. I mean, what would you think the odds are that this ever gets in front of a jury or gets to a trial? Which if you had to guess, Doc?
I would say slim to none.
Yeah.
There's a dollar figure, to quote the $1 Million Man, everybody's got a price. And I don't mean to diminish her and her claim, but there's a number at some point that people say, wow, that is maybe generational wealth. And I can't pass that up. Enough of my stories out there. Enough people know if there are other people, they can come forward. I got to do what's best for me and my family.
To be clear, I'm not trying to talk about the financial aspect, and I don't want to have that big hypothetical debate, but just want to make the distinction. What was filed in January was a civil suit.
Yes.
This is not a criminal proceeding.
That's
so
right.
we're a long way from ever getting in front of a judge or a jury or any of that sort of thing. But what we do know happened that we should talk about in the documentary is the WrestleMania 17 payoff. It's going to be Vince McMahon versus Shane McMahon, a pay-per-view of father versus son, and we're going to have Stephanie involved, and we're going to have Linda involved, and hey man, everybody's here. And it's a silly thing in hindsight, but Eric, one of the biggest pops of the night at WrestleMania 17 was Linda simply standing up out of the wheelchair. I mean, you want to talk about the impact of story. Nobody had to, that's a show, that's a match where we have a Van Terminator. But what people remember most of all is Linda standing up out of the wheelchair. But that's just another one for story in the record books, is it not, Eric?
It was great. Again, I wasn't watching WWE back then, and seeing some of that footage I've seen for the first time as a result of this documentary, and it was classic. I mean, the idea of Trish being Vince's mistress and caretaker for Vince's wife, and she drugged her up so she was kind of catatonic in the wheelchair, and all this stuff was happening in front of her. It's just so good from a storyline perspective. And you're right, when she stands up out of that chair, kicks Vince in the balls, it's a beautiful thing. I love good story when it plays out like that. It's just such a wonderful thing.
I thought, it's interesting because we all know what wrestling is, Dockins, but I thought it was interesting where Shane was hesitant to have any physicality with his dad. I mean, by this point, he's had wrestling matches. He knows what wrestling is, but he didn't want to hurt his dad, despite the fact that I know his dad was older, but his dad was also much bigger physically, and it's his boss, and it's his dad. He's in a weird spot, but the idea that he was weird about it, but Vince was totally cool with it, is telling about the way they feel about each other, maybe. What do you think of that?
What I think about it is, I think about when I'm roughhousing with my son or whatever, I don't want to lay one in, right? Even if we're just, playing and I don't want to be too aggressive. I'm sure Shane was the same way. Like if I potato axe or smash or hawk or animal, whatever. They'll get me with the receipt. It's not a big deal. This is my dad. And so I got to think in his head, hey, I want this to be the best performance I can give. I want this to look as real as possible, but I'm going to pull back on some things because it is my dad.
I think it's just hard to pull that trigger. I mean, I could relate to that. I worked in Angle with Garrett, my son, in TNA, and it got physical. And I had a really hard time mentally laying hands on him in a stiff way. Now, I asked him to punch me right between the eyes, and he was early in his career. And I said, Garrett, you're new at this, and you're going to be nervous, and I'm your dad, and you're going to try not to hurt me, and this is going to look like shit. So you really need to picture the back of my head when you throw that punch, because you need to hit me. And it took a lot of convincing for Garrett. So I understood that. I related to it in a kind of a reverse way, but I understood that. It's a weird thing to haul off and hit somebody you're not mad at. That's the thing. It's and not so much even that it's your dad, but if you're not trained, if you're not used to throwing working punches. Now, if you know how to throw a working punch, it's no big deal, right? But if you're not really good at throwing a working punch, you can throw what you think is a working punch. It's going to look like shit. So it's always better to lay them in. And I can understand it, man. When I had a match with John Cena, or I was doing something with John Cena in the ring, and there was a spot where Cena was hanging over the ropes, feeding me that fucking massive chin of his and jaw. And I was supposed to just haul off and plaster him. Vince said, "Oh, you go out there, pal. You gotta lay that in." And okay. And then John Cena said the same thing. But when it came time to do it, I slapped him like a bitch. Kink. Yeah. If you're not pissed off at somebody, it's hard to hit them.
Well, we know that Shane felt like he needed to protect his dad, and he also makes it clear he felt like he needed to protect his mom. When it was first discussed, him being a character on TV and Stephanie being a character on TV, he was all for it. But when it came time for Linda to be a character, and then Vince doing all these despicable things with Trish right in front of mom, Shane said no. He's not comfortable with that. He was against it. And when the producers tell Vince that, Vince sort of laughs and chuckles and says, hey, it's just story. It's no big deal. Shane was just more conservative and worried that it might be too close to home. I thought that was telling, that at all times, Shane is trying to take care of mom and dad. And we actually have a comment here from somebody watching live with us here, Walrads, who says, Shane made a conscious effort to let his children know how he is proud to be their father. One of his recent posts on social media says, so proud to be Declan's father, not Vince's son, Declan's father. You have to admire Shane's strength. Shane is breaking the cycle. I'm fascinated with Shane in this entire documentary. I'd love to see more from him. I'd love to see if there was some more cutting room floor stuff. Dockins, I don't know that you heard this, but I think there was a report out that they had about 4 hours of tape on Vince that they couldn't use because he lost his voice and he sounded like Kermit the Frog. I still think there's an appetite for that. Man, put that behind a paywall somewhere and let us pay for that. That's a money-making opportunity, this stuff on the cutting room floor, isn't it, Doc?
Absolutely it is. I guarantee there's some nuggets. There's things there that probably would surprise people like you and I, Conrad.
We talk a little bit with Bonnie Hammer from USA Network, and she says that Vince was a master at blurring storylines and pushing the envelope. And then we get a little piece about Sable. Dave Meltzer comes out and says that she was one of the more underrated characters they had. He's bragging about how great her ratings were, and at the peak of her popularity, she leaves the company, Doc, and she sues them for $110 million. When they go back to Vince and ask what he remembers about the lawsuit, he just can't remember any of it. He just remembers that she did come back to work. And that is true. Sable did come back, but when they brought her back, they put her right into a sexualized storyline. This is a story that is so Vince McMahon, you just can't shake it off. What do you make of this whole Sable business? Hey, you're going to sue us for $110 million for sexual harassment. We settle, we bring you back, and now we're going to put you in a sexual harassment storyline. Goodness gracious.
It defies logic. It really does. What I love about that that he doesn't remember anything is I remember back to when I was in law school and I had taken a class that was all about trial prep and being deposed and all of these sorts of things. And there was a mandatory reading, and I hadn't done it at all. And the professor calls on me, and I've got to start acting as though I'm being deposed. And I just said over and over again, I don't recall. Oh, that's a good question. I don't recall. And we do this for 15 minutes. This professor is just grilling me, grilling me, grilling me. And I just keep saying, I don't know. And I would answer if I knew. And other times I'd say, I don't know. And we got done. And he goes, that's one of the best depositions I've ever heard, Mr. Dockins. That's one of the best things I've ever heard. You gave me nothing at all. And a light went off in my head. Like, this is the move. If you're being deposed, I don't remember. And if it can't be demonstrably proven that you do remember, who's to say who's right and who's wrong? So it's a brilliant move by him. But I imagine there was probably some things that were happening behind the scenes, maybe that would have been part of a lawsuit if it had gotten into full discovery, if it had gotten disclosed, that maybe wasn't made privileged as far as the trial was concerned, that maybe had something to do with sexual harassment type things, but that went away and people let bygones be bygones. And it really wasn't about what she was having to do on camera.
We should mention that when the producer brings up that Sable was in an affair with Vince McMahon on TV when she comes back, you can see that Vince is a little thrown off, sort of looking around, and you hear Paul Heyman's voice. I'm sure it was Paul Heyman off camera who says, "Storyline." And I just found that interesting. Like, it almost was like you could see Vince's wheels turning, like, now what is he talking about? And then here's Paul Heyman from the Peanut Gallery. Storyline. What'd you make of that, Eric?
Paul's so smart. I mean, his dad was an attorney, right? And Paul really still does. He worshipped his father and looked up to him so much. And I think it's one, I think Paul's father had a lot to do with the way Paul carries himself, the way he's an advocate. He's not a manager. He's an advocate. And he loves to speak flowingly and in a very grandiose fashion, like he's in a closing argument in a feature film. But he's also really fucking street smart. He is really street smart. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons he was in that room, is to make a save or two if it was needed. And to remind Vince, because, it's hard to remember all this stuff. We talked about that the other day. Time, you're in an interview, they're asking you about 2001, and back in 2090 or back in 1998, this happened, and in 2003. So you're constantly bouncing back and forth in a timeline, and it's easy to get a little confused. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons that Paul was there, is to keep the train on the track, so to speak.
Shout out to John Thompson, who's with us. Greatly appreciate your support as always. You're coming through big for us today. And here's a question for Eric. Vince has a capacity to hire wrestlers back despite their personal feelings against Vince, whether it was Sable, Brett, and even Stone Cold. Do you believe this goes back to his messed up childhood, or Vince really understanding later where that wrestler was coming from?
I think it's neither. I think it's simply, as Vince discussed, and I believe to be a true representation of how he feels and thinks. The past is the past. Can you help me going forward business-wise? Is there money in it? If there is, let's talk. If there's not, see you. I don't think there's any emotion in it whatsoever.
AOTV Productions is with us here live, and they want to know, do you guys think Sable should be in the Hall of Fame? I would say at this point, Eric, if she's not already in, she ain't going in. What do you think?
I don't see it. I mean, look, Sable was a great character. She made great TV for a minute during this era, but did she contribute to the business? Is there anything you can say that the business, how the business was changed or evolved or moved forward because of her role? No, I can't. And to me, that's Hall of Fame. Whether it's you're a performer and you've been in the ring if you're a Ric Flair and you've entertained people around the world, you've contributed to the business. All talent contributes. Everybody in the company contributes to the business, but obviously talent in a more obvious way. But I think for a talent to be in the Hall of Fame, you've got to have done something fairly significant. And she didn't.
I disagree. I think she is as deserving as a lot of folks who are in the WWE Hall of Fame. I suggest the reason she's not going in is all of this stickiness now between what we know about her lawsuit with Vince, the on-air affair with Vince, who she's married to in real life, and Brock Lesnar. We'll maybe talk about him on tomorrow's episode, but I just don't see it. But what do you guys think? We're going to throw up a poll. Do you think that Sable belongs in the WWE Hall of Fame? We want to hear from you. We just actually asked, who was your favorite McMahon performer when it came to television? Shane wins with 42%, which I was a little surprised by. Vince came in second at 37%. I thought he was a shoe-in for the first place. Steph only got 14%, which was kind of surprising. She was a great television character. Maybe no surprise. Linda came in at 6%. Dawkins, who would have been your favorite of the four?
Stephanie, without question. I love to hate her, right? That's when I knew my thinking of wrestling changed when I could recognize that I had sincere, hateful reactions towards people. And then it clicked to me, my goodness, these are actors. They're doing such a great job that they've brought this reaction forward from me that I hate them. Man, now I love them. And that was me and Stephanie.
What about you, Eric? Who was your favorite performer of the four?
Vince.
Yeah.
Vince. And then Stephanie is a very, very close second. And Shane, Vince and Steph. And it's so close between the two, to be honest.
Paul Heyman is next on the documentary to say that Vince's only truly monogamous relationship in his entire life is with the wrestling business. He says the business is Vince's master and the business owns him, and he serves it with his heart, his passion, and his life, even if it hurts the feelings of his wife, his kids, his father, or even his own. This was like one of the more profound statements in the entire series. And once again, you nailed it on the head earlier, Dawkins. It comes from the mouth of Paul Heyman. I think you can sum up Vince just with that one statement from Paul, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's interesting, I think we're probably going to talk about eventually where the WWE had gone public, right? And when all this stuff about Vince recently came out and, we can oust him and all of this, and certain members of the board were removed and he appointed other people, even when he kind of gave up control of the WWE, he didn't actually give up control of the WWE because his first and only true love is wrestling.
It's amazing to think that we quickly shift gears from this conversation about his family into going public. And he lays out that, this made them legitimate and afforded them opportunities for other business ventures, like the restaurant, which failed, like the XFL, which failed, like the casino, which failed. There's a lot of missed opportunities in Vince's rearview mirror. And that's where his critics would jump on, Eric, and say, oh, this guy had one good idea, the WWE, and that wasn't even his. He bought it from his dad. That always felt like sour grapes to me. But I do think that he maybe took his eye off the ball a little bit once they went public. I know as a wrestling fan, I sort of started to fall out of love with it during that period. Do you think Vince got distracted with all the other business ventures, Eric? It feels like a callback to an earlier episode in the series where we heard someone say, I think it was Tony Atlas, Vince didn't want to be in the wrestling business. He wanted to be in the entertainment business. It feels like he was trying everything he could outside of wrestling in this era, Eric.
Yes, I think he got distracted. Anybody would. Want to go back, though, just for a beat, and then I'll follow up a little bit more on that question. It's interesting to me, again, looking at the timeline and the pivot points in WWE's path, the things that really, really changed the landscape, not only for WWE, but for the industry as a whole. And, we spent a lot of time in 4 talking about the Attitude Era and how far they went and the raunchy stuff. And we're even talking about it here in episode 5. There's a lot of over-the-top, overly sexualized content in WWE during this period of time. But that's what WWE had to do. Had they not gone to that extreme, had they not gone so far, even crossing lines of tastefulness even back then, I don't think that they would have been able to galvanize that 18 to 49 demo and increase ratings to the extent that they did, which set them up to go public. Had they stayed in their family-friendly orientation and marketing plans and the way they produce their television, had they not gone as far as they did, and I'm especially with the sexualized stuff, I'm not sure that they would have been able to create as much controversy that created the mega amount of cash and success as a television property. If they wouldn't have achieved that by use of that type of approach to content, I don't think they would have gone public. And had they not gone public, who knows where they'd be today. Going back to your first question, though, we've seen a pattern now with Vince, even going back to the first episode, second episode. The bodybuild, WBF, the XFL, the Vince always saw WWE, the brand, as being bigger than just the product in the ring. And I know from the outside, especially if you're a critic or you think you know more about shit than you really do, it's easy to say, oh, he's just a one-hit wonder, and he's only good at wrestling, and he should have stuck to what he knows, and all the kind of typical ignorant bullshit you find on social media for people that have never done anything in their lives or attempted to. I think what Vince was trying to do was grow the brand consistent with the vision that he had early on, that WWE be bigger than a wrestling company. I think once he went public and had an extraordinary amount of cash to play with, then he was probably a little bit like a kid in a candy store. Every opportunity seemed like a great opportunity. Everything that Vince had been through, WWE had been through, from say 93, 94 steroid trial, getting their ass kicked by WCW, almost going broke, locking the doors and all the stuff that we've heard about, to them pulling the nose up. And within a very brief period of time, now they're, on the New York Stock Exchange, and they have access to hundreds of millions of dollars. That would make anybody a little distracted, I think.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I appreciate that he was swinging for the fences and trying to, conquer, have new challenges. I mean, that's the way it feels to me. It's like once he's bought ECW, once he's beat WCW and purchased it too, like what's left for him to conquer in wrestling? Maybe he just needs a new challenge. Maybe he needs something new to overcome, and maybe that's all rooted in the childhood. But what do I know? Go ahead, Doc.
Well, I was going to say to that point, Eric, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Hearing what Conrad just said and reading through some of these things, and earlier to the question about, hey, why does Vince hire people back? In some of these instances where there were lawsuits and a settlement was paid, you could take the approach that, hey, that's kind of hanging a little bit of a loss on Vince or WWE, that they had to pay some money. When you hire people back in, you get to put them in funny positions where you take back that control. At least that's kind of how I look at it. You're taking back the control when you had a little bit of a loss. Maybe you took a punch. Now you get to punch back on screen, in character, and all of that. Any thoughts about that? That maybe there's, again, whether intentional or not, some psychology of Vince to, yeah, for some of these people, I can make money on them, right? Of course, I agree with that completely. But also,
I'll get the last laugh.
I'm going to remind them who's in charge.
You're right, Doc. And I thought about that a couple of days ago. Again, just seeing patterns and listening to commentary, trying to figure this cat out. Not that I'm any closer now than I would have ever been, but control is kind of the common denominator in anything that Vince seems to be involved with. He was a control freak. When I worked with him for the 4 months in 19, his fingerprints were all over everything. Nothing happened unless Vince reviewed every syllable of an interview, a promo, in ring or otherwise. He's a control freak from the ground up. And I think to a degree you're right. Because people have always said, the only reason they bring people back is to humiliate them. Vince humiliated his own family in the ring as characters.
Yeah.
Consistently in a very, very loud way. So it wasn't personal. When I went there, everybody said, "Oh, he's going to humiliate you," and that was the rap for a lot. WCW. If you were in WCW, yeah, you get a job in WWE, but Vince is going to embarrass you. Probably true, but look at what he did with his own, people in his own company. The Kiss My Ass Club.
Yeah.
I fortunately dodged that bullet, but I'm one of the very few that was asked to do it and didn't do it. It's not. Doc, you're absolutely right. It's not what people think. Oh, Vince loves to put people in awkward positions because he wants to embarrass them as retribution. I think it's reminding you that he writes a check and you need to do what he says to do. And once he establishes that control, he's like, check that box, and now we can have a great relationship. That's the way it seemed to me.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
50% of the folks listening to this think that Sable does belong in the Hall of Fame. Keep those questions coming for Eric, Mike Dockins, and myself. Let's do a question now. Brandon says, Vince Doc was good for casuals, but if you're a mark, most stories are well known. Still, there were bright spots. Are there any untold stories you wish they covered? We'll start with you, Dockins. Is there a story you wish you would have heard more about?
There probably is, and to Eric's earlier point that this was probably going in a direction as a documentary one way before all the news hit and the lawsuit hit and all of that, and then they kind of repackaged it and maybe spun it a little differently. And by no means am I an apologist for if these things are true, an apologist for somebody who's done some pretty bad things. But Vince has done a lot of good for a lot of people. He's done a lot of good for charities and the association with the military and all of that. I would have liked to see some of that. I can understand why they didn't. They were trying to tell a certain story in a certain way. But I think there is a lot of good that maybe he doesn't get credit for because I don't think he ever wanted credit for it.
Doc, you were so right about that. And again, I hesitate to say this for the same reason you did, because if you say anything nice about Vince McMahon, all of a sudden now you're supporting him and all that. And it's not this. But I'm also aware of people who have passed away and their families couldn't afford a funeral, or if they did, it wouldn't have been amount to much. And Vince McMahon, and for people that he wasn't particularly close to, one person for sure, and I'm not going to mention the name because it's not my business, but I know that happened. Nobody knows that. Well, very few people. Obviously, the family on the other end did, but never hear word of that. And there are so many situations like that. Bruce Pritchard was the most eloquent and I think the most poignant, because Vince did save Stephanie Pritchard's life by being able to contribute financially to the type of care that she needed desperately that they couldn't have afforded otherwise. So that's why I say so complex. It's easy to believe everything that you read and jump on the bandwagon without any understanding of the person or maybe the other side of the story. And I would have liked to have heard a little bit of it, because that's contrast. It would have made a better documentary, frankly, because it would make things more balanced in a way that you'd be going, wait a minute, how could this guy be this guy, but yet do these things that he never got any credit for or acknowledgement of? And we didn't really see much of that. And I think you're right, Doc. It would have made it a better documentary to see it.
It does feel like, and I know that we're going to talk a lot about this tomorrow, but it feels like a lot of people have decided that they want to come at Bruce Pritchard for having anything nice to say and speak about those nice things. But I just want to remind everybody, there's no such thing as a human being that's all good or all bad. There's shades of gray. People do nice things, and unfortunately, most of us wind up doing a few bad things that we regret later too. But if you say anything to speak in Vince's defense right now, it comes off a little bit like, but what about all the good things Hitler did? And I get that nobody wants to have that conversation, but think about the way the world viewed Bill Cosby 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. All you heard was all the positive stuff. Now, of course, we have a lot more context to the criminal behavior he was up to, but it doesn't mean that the way we felt about the nice things he didn't exist. And I think that's a real challenge for people in a social media age where we are quick to categorize someone as good or bad, and there's no in between. I'm not defending what Vince did at all, but I do get what you're saying, Doc, that we didn't highlight anything that was positive
Nothing.
because he did do a lot of great things, but it's not in fashion to talk about that because we've learned about some really terrible things that he's done. And I know that our buddy Bruce, because I think everybody on this right now is friends with Bruce in real life, boy, he's taking a lot of shots right now, and I think unnecessarily, because you can love a person and hate their actions. And if you've ever had anybody in your life or in your family who's had a substance issue or it's just real life challenges where life didn't go according to plan, you can be disappointed in their actions and hate what they did, but still love the person. Why is that lost in this discourse online right now, Dockins, do you think?
People are just fascinated with the negative, right? And kind of what Eric alluded to. I think people don't want to be seen as, oh, we're an apologist, we're ignoring what happened to these people that were victimized or whatever, and this is a bad person. I mean, that's unfortunately it's human nature, right? This isn't just Vince. This is a long time coming for a lot of people. I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm working out or driving or whatever, and you hear these stories about people who've done awful things, criminals and whatever. And sometimes you'll hear where the victim's family has embraced that person's family because they've said, hey, a lot of people have lost something here. You guys are kind of victims too. And people, whether they've done something wrong or not, have people that love them. Right. And we just forget that. We want to vilify people and jump on the villainy and forget that, like you said, Conrad, there's a lot of gray here.
Well, and it's easy to do, right? Especially with social media, because it gets action, it gets likes and reposts and all the other silly shit that people apparently really, really need badly in their lives. I mean, it's like what was the Eagle song, "Dirty Laundry"? Man, it's always been that way. People just love other people's misery, and they love to dance on their graves because it makes them feel better about themselves. They kind of forget to look in the mirror and think back of all the other things that they've done in their lives. And I'll speak to that myself, that have, as Conrad said, that you regret and you wish you wouldn't have done. It's really easy to judge people, to play God and pass judgment on others. And it now has become, with social media, it's become a recreational activity. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. I loved hearing your take, Doc, because it's very true, and yours as well, Conrad.
We want to hear from you guys. What do you think? We'll go to Dawkins' point here. Do you think the documentary crew should have shown some positive about Vince, or did they get it right? We're going to throw up a poll here, and we want to hear from you. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on that notifications bell. 83weeks.com is your home for all things Eric Bischoff, and we're not done. We're going to continue our talk on episode 5, but join us this time tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern on Monday, where we'll be breaking down perhaps the most important and the most currently relevant episode of the entire documentary. Our gimmick attorney, Mike Dockins, will be joining us as well because we got some legal wrangling to discuss. So go ahead and set that alarm bell now. Hey, let's go ahead and talk about the WCW purchase. That's the next big piece of the story. Bischoff, this is a blip. I mean, we've covered it 182 times here on the show. We don't have to hit it again. They do get a soundbite, a few that made me laugh, where Bruce says, it felt like WCW wasn't even trying. I laughed out loud when he said it because I said to myself, he did that to make Eric Bischoff laugh, I'm sure. And then later, Booker says, Eric did a lot of great things, but he did a lot wrong. And you would clarify and say, well, I understand why someone would say that, but they had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. And we sort of lay out the path of exactly how the acquisition happened. And one of the more telling, maybe poignant moments about the way Vince really feels about competition is he talked about how Ted Turner likes to talk about squishing his squishing his competition like a bug, but he looks right at the camera and says, that didn't happen. The glee in his eye when he felt like he beat Ted Turner, man, it just came right off the screen, didn't it, Eric?
That's the fighter. That's the guy that would rather fight than do anything else. And that was an honest reaction. That was a real look into Vince McMahon. It's just who he's been his whole life. It's why WWE is where WWE is today. No doubt about it. But yeah, it was funny. It's true too.
I love that he says it wasn't. I didn't take great joy in winning. I expect to win. And I know that that's going to rub people the wrong way, but I think you have to have that sort of attitude in life and in business and in entrepreneurial efforts. If you're going to go into something saying, "Boy, I hope it works out," well, here's a spoiler: it ain't fucking gonna. But if you go into it and say, "Man, this thing's going to be awesome. We're going to do this, and we're going to," if you approach that endeavor with that level of fervor, you increase your odds. So Vince knows that, and he's trained his brain to think that way. But I found it interesting too that from that sentence we immediately jumped to Brian Gerwitz, who says that in a way it was bittersweet him buying WCW because Vince thrives under pressure and competition, and that's the real story right there. Like, you want to talk about the lull that wrestling went in after the Attitude Era? It's because Vince had no competition. And I know some people in the live chat will say, "Well, TNA again, Vince had no competition." That was the difference, don't you think, Eric?
He had no one to fight. He had no reason to
Yes.
get up in the morning. There was no cliff. There was no cliff that he might fall off of. You know, in many ways, it sounds like maybe Shane and being the adrenaline junkie that he's always been. I think Vince was has his own kind of adrenaline habit. And in Vince's case, it was business, and we didn't have anything to prove or anybody to fight. I think he got bored.
Doc, I know you love sports like I do. So when we got to see Bob Costas in here talking about the XFL, and he said something along the lines of, "I don't give a fuck." I know I'm 43 years old. This shouldn't be entertaining to me, but I was like, Bob Costas just said fuck. It just felt weird. What'd you think of that?
Same thing. Same thing. It's like the first time being a kid and hearing one of your grandparents say a curse word. Oh God, what just happened? What did I just hear? I'm with you. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. To Eric's point about the about competition, and your point too, Conrad. It honestly it reminded me a lot of the last was it the last ride? What they call it? The Jordan documentary, the Bulls documentary.
Last
Where
Dance.
Last Dance. Thank you. Where Michael Jordan, he's the best, right? He had all these championships, but there was somebody he always had to make the enemy, right? It was Isaiah Thomas at first, then he slayed that demon. Then it was the Knicks. Then he just started making stuff up. Tom Brady had Peyton Manning. Joe Montana had Dan Marino. Like, you know, what is it? Iron sharpens iron, or whatever the saying is. He lost that, right? He lost it because he didn't have that thing to drive him that you see constantly in sports all the time.
And that's a mentality, isn't it? I mean, you see it more often now that you bring that up. It's a really good observation and cool. And it seems apparent in sports, but not so much in business. But you wonder, you know, the Elon Musk, the Bill Gates, you know, who's the dude that owns Google, whatever, rich fucker. You wonder is that how they feel? I mean, do you have those same parallels with people at the very upper echelons of business? The same that do you have that competitive need to be in a war? I don't know. Makes sense to me. I get it.
I think
Otherwise, why are you pushing yourself? What are you pushing yourself for, if not to win or achieve or conquer something?
Yeah, I think they all find an enemy. I really do. Whether it's real or not.
Yes, whether it's real or not. I appreciate that. We got to look for motivation. And we want to ask you guys, hey, well, did you think this docuseries was for non-fans? And 50% said yes. 40% said it was for casuals, and only 10% say it had anything for hardcores. No real surprise there. I want to know, do you guys think that the WWE, because everyone listening to this, at least at one point, was a big WWE fan, do you think the WWE needed competition in order to thrive? I mean, even the boom that they're under right now, Eric, I'm not saying it's because of AEW, but it is interesting that they've been climbing and been on an absolute tear since AEW became a thing. On some level, just any competition might be good for the business. Surprise! Nobody knows that better than you, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
let's move on. I mean, I can't. I don't. Okay. Cool.
I love you for that. Hey, let's talk about Vince taking the big L. He had to look right down the barrel of the camera and say the World Wildlife Fund had been using those letters a lot longer than we had. So we had to change. Of all the battles that Vince lost through his career, this may have been the biggest one, Doc, don't you think?
It's what I love about this, and I did a deep dive at looking into this some months back, is the nuance that was in it. Because I don't think that's an L that Vince takes if the timing is different. He's fresh off of the steroid trial. He's getting his butt handed to him by Eric. He can't afford Bret Hart's contract. Money was a problem. And when it comes to trademarks and when it comes to intellectual property, they're all territorial things. So WWF had a trademark in the US. They had it in Canada. They had it in Mexico. They had it in Belgium and Switzerland and all these different places. And there's no one court system where the Wildlife Foundation could challenge and take care of all of it. They had to go to each of the places. So now WWF, the wrestling company, is fighting a battle about trademarks on a dozen different fronts. That's a dozen different countries with a dozen different law firms and lawyers that they had to pay
and laws.
Yes,
and the laws are completely different.
Yes, the laws have some overlap, but they are very much different. Particularly,
even the process of litigating is
There you
completely
go.
different. If you're in the UK, if Dawkins and I are in the UK or Australia, let's use Australia. If we're in Australia, because I learned that one the hard way. If Dawkins lives in Australia, I live in the US, and I have to sue Dawkins, I'm toast. The laws are so different. In the UK, if Dawkins lives in the UK and I live in the UK and I sue Dawkins and I lose, I have to pay his attorney's fees.
Yes,
It's bizarre, when you're fighting on those fronts. It's a good point. I never thought of that, Dawkins. Thank you. That's a smart observation.
I just don't think that they could take that on at that time, because I think from a legal perspective, they shouldn't have lost, right? That was not something they lost. And if you look into it, they didn't actually lose, right? What happened was WWF, and again, this is my opinion, they couldn't fight that battle, and they couldn't fight it on all those fronts, and they couldn't afford to fight it financially speaking, given where they were. So they entered into a settlement agreement. And that's ultimately where they got an L hung on them, is they signed the settlement agreement, said they would change it, all the things they couldn't do. They had a roadmap that was laid out. And then fast forward, not a couple years later, they're flush with cash. They're laying on piles of money, and they can do whatever they want. And so a decision was made by somebody, you know what? Forget that settlement agreement. We're going to stay the WWF. We're going to keep doing our thing because now I can afford to fight it. I'll fight them on all the fronts because I can take them now. I've got the financial resources. But at that point, you've got a contractual dispute, not a trademark dispute. And the contract was pretty clear what they could and couldn't do. And they had no chance of winning that because they just outright ignored the settlement agreement. So ultimately, what they lost on was a settlement agreement, not a trademark infringement.
Great take. You are I don't know why they call you the gimmick attorney, man. That's some cool shit. You're laying on our 83weeks.com family. Every person watching this right now or listening to this is smarter than they were when they woke up this morning. I love when that happens.
Well, Eric, you live to enlighten, and Doc's going to be with us again tomorrow for episode 6. That's where we're going to do some heavy lifting on the legal stuff, but I knew he had some knowledge to drop on the whole Panda over Vince. Wow, what a weird deal that was. Hey, let's talk a little bit about WrestleMania 18. We know that's where Hulk Hogan's going to come back, and things are going to change. He's no longer going to be a heel. He's going to set the woods on fire with an incredible match with The Rock. But this is where creative starts to get a little more challenging. And they also talk about how Vince always brings back people that he feuded with. And on some level, if you were difficult with him, he's more likely to bring you back than if you played ball, according to Dave Meltzer. So we talk about you coming to work there. And we also talk about the frustrations that are there for a guy like Steve Austin. We see clips of him appearing on Bite This, and he's walking out. So now we're going to create sort of the ruthless aggression era. This is where John Cena is born. We briefly cover the story there where, Stephanie overhears him rapping on the back of the bus, and here we go. But creative is down for everyone. Maybe nobody more than Austin, who walks out. But we do like a montage, if you will, of maybe what I would call the dark days of WWE, Eric. We see Vince making people kiss his ass. We see Vince mocking God in church. We see Vince pushing a kid down the steps in a wheelchair. We see Katie Vick. I mean, there's some crazy stuff here, But then we see an interview with Trish that we've never seen before, that was new for the documentary, where she says sometimes if you didn't go along with the creative, you'd get punished. And she felt like when she was asked to make out with a woman on TV and she refused, she was punished when she lost the title to Mickie James the next week at WrestleMania. Eric, you were around. Have you seen Vince punish people for creative? If they pushed back on an idea, would he then try to force them to do something else they didn't like? What do you make of that?
I never saw anything like that. I mean, when I was there as a talent for 3 or 4 years, whatever it was, I came in, I got my work, I got my script, I went off by myself, got comfortable with it, rehearsed it, produced it, or did it in the ring, and I went home. Didn't really interact with too many people. I specifically made a point not to get too friendly with too many people. It was easier for me just to kind of stay a little bit on outside of the bubble, so to speak, and outside of the group. So I never really engaged in conversations with talent that may have experienced things like that. It certainly never happened to me. By the way, going back to the Kiss My Ass Club that we're covered here, I did get that at a script. I was sitting at home in Los Angeles. I kept an apartment there, and it was Saturday afternoon, and I get this email, and it's like, okay, here's your script, and I'm doing the Kiss My Ass gimmick in the ring, and this was not long after I got there, and I called whoever my producer was probably Bruce or somebody else, and I said, here's why I don't think it's a good idea. I'll do it, but I think it's a really bad idea, and I think the timing's bad. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody committed to me that they were going to do it or not do it. I pushed back on it. I got to TV Monday. I got my scripts, and it was gone. And I never got punished. Now, maybe it's because of the way I went about it. I was pretty deferential and respectful the way I did it. So maybe that alleviated some of that. But I never personally experienced it, and that would have been a chance for me to do that if that was, the way Vince operated all the time. I don't know what happened with Trish. I'm not involved in that. And I didn't hear that kind of thing. There's always the impression, there was always that perception that, Vince is going to make you do things that, he wants you to do. And if you refuse, you're going to get punished. I never experienced it. I never saw anybody experience it, but obviously Trish feels differently. So I can't really speak to it.
How much longer after you refused to kiss Vince's ass did he throw you in the back of a garbage truck?
A couple of years.
Okay. I was just asking.
And by the way, that was my idea for Vince to do it. So
I'm busting balls, Eric. Come on.
Not connected. All
right. Let's talk a little bit about the crazy idea that Stephanie almost didn't want to tell on camera, but we've heard it before from Bruce, and now the story is public for everyone. I guess maybe this was in a documentary DVD years ago too. The idea of when Stephanie became pregnant, goddamn, pal, what if I did it? Now, Eric, you've been in some weird spots where Vince was once your most bitter rival. And then once you went to work for him, he said, hey, man, what if you made out with my wife and daughter? And I stood in the corner and coached them up. This is weird. And perhaps even weirder than that is when he suggests, goddamn, pal, what if I got my daughter pregnant? This is some out there shit, man. What do you make of this?
I don't know what to make of it. That's like what makes those wheels turn in one's head. Like, how are you wired so that an idea like that pops into your head and then out of your mouth? I don't know. When I said the other day, he's one of the most complicated cats I've ever been anywhere near. There's a good example.
John Thompson is with us, and he says, question for Eric after this episode, do you believe that the whole McMahon family needs deep psychological family therapy, or have they always talked about these issues? I don't know, but I'll tell you this. If Vince still wants to create content, Vince McMahon doing a series about him going to therapy, sign me up, because I can't imagine it. That seems more fiction than anything we've talked about here today. What do you think, Eric?
Make a hell of a reality show.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? Would Bischoff Hervey Entertainment get that one sold, you think?
Oh, yeah. A chimp with a banana could get that sold.
Oh my gosh. Doc, I thought one of the more fascinating pieces about the family dynamic is where Stephanie is basically honest and says, I know that dad was harder on Shane than he was me. And Vince even says, you're a McMahon. Shut the hell up. Step the hell up. My apologies. He was harder on him. He's acknowledging he's harder on him. And he even says something like, I used to shoot down their ideas just to teach them a lesson, which I thought was just crazy. As a wrestling fan, I want the best idea to win, not necessarily the best idea from someone we're not trying to teach a lesson. That was a glimpse into WWE creative that I wish I never got. But just to come out and say, hey, I'm harder on my son than I am my daughter, or the daughter say he was harder on my brother than he was me. Is that natural for all dads? I'm asking you, Doc. I know you've got a boy and a girl. Are you harder on your boy than you are your girl?
I think I am, and I'm open with it with him about it, and my wife, where my daughter needs a little bit of a gentler hand if something's happening. If I use a gentle hand with my son, which sometimes I do, he doesn't react. But if I use the dad voice, hey, what are you doing? He like this. He gets back in line. And my wife tries a gentler hand with both of them all the time, and she doesn't react or interact with him the same way that I do. We just have a different expectation of. I know what it's like to grow up with a boy. Obviously, I don't know what it's like to grow up a little girl. And I think I know what he can take and what he can't take as far as, hey, I'm going to be a little bit harder on you. It's going to pay off for you later. So I think it's a very natural way to deal with their kids.
Eric, one of the things that really jumped out to me, because we had heard it through the newsletters, but, well, I know how you feel about newsletters. But we hear a report back then that Vince was trying to be talked into buying the UFC by Shane, that Shane was really high on the UFC and knew it was available and it could be had for a song. And maybe he felt like this could be something of my own. Dad, you keep running WWE, I'll run this thing. Obviously, we know that like $2 to $4 million investment turned into like 4 billion. And when the interviewers are asking Vince if he regrets not buying it, Vince says no. And something along the lines of, Shane should have had more money and bought it himself if that's what he wanted to do. And I just thought this was just crazy. The idea that you could bring anybody an idea. And I mean, this is the same guy who greenlit the World Restaurant and the XFL twice, and the WBF and the Debbie Reynolds Casino, and. But even with the benefit of hindsight, well, they turned 2 million into 4 billion. No, I don't regret it. Shane should have bought it if he wanted it so damn bad. What? That tells you everything you need to know about the way Vince feels about Shane, where even with the benefit of hindsight, he's not giving him any credit for the idea, Eric.
Yeah, I think Vince was trying to recreate a mirror image of his own way of thinking and handling business. And Shane just wasn't, that's just not Shane. I don't think it's anybody else, by the way. I think Vince is incredibly unique as an individual. I don't think anybody could operate like Vince McMahon did. But I do think he was trying to push Shane. And I think I don't want to say disappointment. I don't want to suggest that Vince is disappointed in Shane. But if there is disappointment there, it's because Shane just wouldn't become the animal with respect to his business approach that Vince was. It just wasn't there. And I think Vince, my impression is that Vince's comment reflected that kind of disappointment.
Well, I was disappointed to see the story that Paul Heyman told next, and I want to believe that it's not true. The idea being that Shane was campaigning in a creative meeting for an idea that Vince didn't like. And allegedly, at some point, after they go back and forth a few times about the idea, Vince hands Shane a knife and tells him to stab him in the heart because that's the only way this idea will happen. And if you don't do it, I'll know you're man enough or you weren't man enough to do it. I mean, what a crazy thing to say. If you want your idea to happen, it's going to happen over my dead body. You're going to have to take it from me. You're going to have to get me out of the way like I did my father. That's the implication. I mean, this feels like Shakespeare, not wrestling, not real life. Doc, don't you hope that there's just some creative license in that story? That can't be real.
I do hope so. And I think my guess is what Vince is struggling with as a father is this weird dichotomy of I want my kids' lives to be better than mine was. And I think by all accounts, their lives were better. But at the same time, Vince knows that the sum of his experiences is what drove him to be successful. So he's got to manufacture some of that stuff so that his kids can experience it. And so even if this is 100% true, Conrad, do I think he actually believed that? Or do I think he had to go over the top because he was trying to make a point and he doesn't know how to do it because he has taken care of his kids? They have enjoyed a much better, easier, more profitable life than he did. But he wants them to learn that stuff.
Again, great take, Doc. But you know what's really ironic is that Vince is pushing Shane. Let's just take what Vince said at face value. Over the top or not, he pushes Shane and hands him a knife, says, if you want to do this, you're going to have to drive it through my chest into my heart because it's the only way this idea is going to fly as if I'm dead. And and if you don't do it, I'll know that you're not capable of doing what I had to do to my father to get him out of the way. Fast forward, somebody sent that anonymous email to the board of directors. There's speculation that it was Stephanie. Ironic that Stephanie was the one that got him out of the way. If indeed she did, if indeed she was responsible for that anonymous email.
That goes back to our earlier conversation, right? Which one's more like Vince?
Kind of makes you think a little bit.
It does, doesn't it?
Especially when she goes out on TV and leads the entire crowd in a "Thank you, Vince" chant. And the minute he comes back, she takes her leave of absence one step further and makes it a permanent resignation.
Just saying.
My goodness. We want to hear from you guys. We are live at 83weeks.com. Now's your chance to ask the gimmick attorney, Mike Dockins, which, by the way, being an attorney is not a gimmick. It's real deal. He will sue your ass. And he's here to keep me out of trouble. And Eric, if we say something stupid. But Eric will answer your questions, too. And if he gets out of bounds, Dockins will say, on advice of legal counsel.
Yeah. Go ahead and move on from there.
Let's move on. Let's finish up the episode here. We're going to talk about Shane making the decision to leave the company. And I thought this was really nice of Shane, where he's talking about how they weren't seeing eye to eye, they weren't getting along, and he valued the relationship with his dad more than he did working at WWE. And he wasn't going to fight his dad. And he was almost sort of all shucks, can you even imagine that? I'm not going to do that to my dad. And Vince even says, hey, everyone has their place, and Shane's vision may have worked, but this is my business, so it's my vision. And then he advises anyone watching this to not bring their family into their business. Goodness gracious. Considering what you just suggested as a possibility, Eric, sure words have never been spoken. My goodness. This is one of the more underrated sleeper episodes. When it was all finished, how do you think they did as far as telling the story about the family business, Dockins?
I thought they did a good job, right? It's very complicated, it's very complex, and you've got very different personalities, meanwhile, that are also kind of similar in personalities. I thought they did a good job. I thought they did a really good job of making the viewers ask questions and start to think about what's really under the surface that's not part of the documentary.
Exactly. And I think when you can get a documentary audience to ask questions, that's again going back to why I would have liked to have seen a little bit of a contrast in who Vince is, as opposed to just kind of a one-sided take, so to speak. I agree that I think they did a great job. I think largely, when it comes to the family business episode 5, one of the things that made it so interesting to me was Shane. Again,
Yep.
There was so much honesty there. He was being 100% transparent, at least the Shane that I know. And it just brought so much authenticity to the story that you don't typically get. Stephanie was interesting, but she scratched the surface more or less. I think Shane actually gave us an insight that we would not otherwise have.
When it was over, Eric, I just wanted to give Shane a hug.
Yes.
I was thinking the same thing.
Truly, I'm like, man, if that was my friend, I'd hug him. Like, God bless you, man.
especially if you spend an hour around him or 20 minutes. He's just a guy you want to hang out with. He's just a good, fun, and smart and talented person.
Well, we appreciate you fun and smart and talented people joining us here live. Thank you, Rich, for gifting 10 more memberships to 83weeks.com. We greatly appreciate that. We ran a poll here asking, how will Vince be remembered? 37% said a flawed and fascinating man. 23% said a good guy who had trauma and flaws. 22% said a bad guy capable of good. And 18% said a terrible man. We're going to get to the Q&A portion. The questions have been flowing in. We'll try to get to as many as we can here. Shout out to PJ Taints, who's a new member here at 83weeks.com.
Go PJ.
John Thompson says, question for Eric. What advice would you have given to Vince McMahon about his terrible childhood? Also, would he have shared his childhood with you if he wanted to? Did you guys ever talk about your upbringing together, Eric?
Zero. We never had one conversation that could be remotely considered a personal conversation, ever.
John's also pointing out that there's been a lot of abuse in wrestling through the years. Abused folks, whether it was Vince or Jake the Snake or Brian Pillman Jr., others as well. Here's an interesting question for you, Eric, from MTV. After watching this documentary, if Bill Simmons approached you about wanting to make a documentary about your life, would you trust him to do it justice?
I don't know. Maybe after watching this thing a few times, I watched the first 6 episodes and I've gone back and watched each episode once all the way up to this one. Maybe right now I'm just not feeling like I want to get anywhere near a documentary. It's just, I feel a little icky. But trust, I don't know. Trust is a little tough for me. It's hard to come by. It's hard for me to trust someone. And I have to get to know him pretty well before I do. So I doubt it. Maybe he could gain my trust, or I could let my guard down, but it would take a bit.
That's the very honest answer, Eric, and I appreciate that. But this from TV deals, that we could build that trust into a contract, right? Where you have,
but honestly, you say that, and I know you're right, because I've tried to do that myself on a number of occasions.
It's hard to get it, but yeah.
However, a good somebody like Bill Simmons, Scott Silver. I mean, when Scott was writing the movie, and I was working with Scott a little bit, helping and facilitating, Scott was adamant about telling the story he wanted to tell. And most documentary producers that are worth their salt at that level, you're not going to get any creative control. You may want it, you may fight for it, but you're not going to get it from them. And Vince didn't get it.
John Thompson is going to point out that, in his opinion, the McMahon family television characters are the #1 dysfunctional family on TV. Once upon a time, that was the Osbournes. But ever since then, it's probably got to be the McMahons, right, Don?
I just heard a story on the news this morning about the Brady Bunch kids. That's a whole nother story right there. But yeah, I would have in our lifetimes, I would say that the McMahon, the family as a whole has to be one of the most interesting stories in American pop culture in the last 30 or 40 years, if not longer.
Ryan Potter's... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Conrad. I almost look at it from the opposite perspective of, if somebody wrote a story and they wrote the story that is the McMahon story, it would never get greenlit. People would say, there's no way there's this woman who's going to be on Donald Trump's cabinet, and there's this guy who has all these claims, and this kid who went off to China and was doing shoe things. Nobody would ever believe it. And it was real life.
We should point out that we're still live, and if you guys have questions, we're going to hang around and answer as many of those as we can. So keep them coming here at 83weeks.com. And as a reminder, this time tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern on Monday, Mike Dockins will be joining us again. And although I've been pretty taboo about saying her name, the complaint from January, we're going to be talking about that and more here tomorrow. So make plans to join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. AOTV Productions says, hey, guys, what do you think Vince is going to say when he meets God and God asks why he booked him in a wrestling match in a losing effort? Goodness gracious. I can't imagine that conversation. I don't know that that'll come up, though, if I'm honest with you.
Pal, I'm just trying to create emotion.
I mean, yeah, you think he'd have to not say the God part of that, or maybe it would be God, comma, damn, I was trying to draw money. Ryan Potter says, Eric taught me the underdog can win. Thank you, Eric. Hey, that's a nice compliment for you on a Sunday, Eric.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that.
Mark Neville says, should they do a documentary on how corrupt Paul Heyman was? He stole and owed money and ruined lives. I think Mark Neville's not a big Paul Heyman fan. I don't know that there'd be a huge appetite for an ECW documentary in 2024. Do you, Doc?
ECW, not necessarily, I don't think. But I think Paul Heyman is such a talented and fascinating person. A story about his life where a portion of it would be ECW. I think people would want to see that. I think that would be
I
fascinating.
absolutely agree. I mean, Paul's story, his journey through professional wrestling is fascinating, particularly where you look at where he is now. I mean, he's incredibly successful and has been since he was 16. It's really a fascinating story. I agree with you, Doc. I think it would be a great documentary.
Dawkins, if you were to make a list of personalities in and around wrestling, and you could say, my number one wish for Bill Simmons to do a documentary on next in the wrestling space would be blank, who would it be?
Ooh, Paul would be a good choice. It would be near the top. I think Sputnik Monroe would be a fascinating one to me.
I mean, is there someone who's living? Someone
who's
living.
Boy, there's somebody who not a lot. Well, maybe more than I give credit for, but Steve Borden, Sting. He just has always been so private, and his life journey and where he came from and the things he went through and where he is now and helping build up his sons and all of that. I think that would be a very interesting, but a very different. I think it'd be a very feel good sort of documentary.
A good storyline kind of takes you on an emotional roller coaster of a journey, so to speak. And I think, to agree with you, Doc, Steve Borden, early life, California, seemed to live a pretty good life. I don't know much about his childhood. Certainly got into the wrestling business at a very young age and was successful, but he hit a wall, and it was a dark one, and it took a toll on him and his family. And then he pulled the nose up, and he came out so much better as a result, much like Lex Luger. Found his faith, and he's a completely different human being now than he was then in so many different ways. And that emotional roller coaster of a journey set against what everybody thinks when they see Sting or hear his name, I think that would be a great story. Here we're making money for other people here. Just so, well, Doc, it'll all come back to you. These were your ideas. We've got proof of it here. This was the origination of those ideas. So you should be able to at least tie yourself in for legal fees.
We want to hear from you guys. If there was one other personality that Bill Simmons was going to do a documentary series on, one other personality in the wrestling space, who would you like for that to be? Let us know in the comments. Shout out to John Thompson, who's just gifted 10 memberships here at 83weeks.com.
John's been on a roll with us here the last few days, man. We're going to have to meet this guy somewhere and take him out to dinner or something fun.
We need to get him camera ready and have him jump on, do a run-in with us. Shout out to Sadman Steve for donating to the cause. Greatly appreciate you throwing in and donating with us today. AOTB Productions says, hey, guys, I've learned that Vince doesn't sleep. He believes sleep is the enemy. I wonder if he's gotten any sleep recently. Did you hear anything like that when you were there, Eric?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all the time. All the time. When I got there now, when I was there as a talent, I would no big deal. But when I was there for a few months in 19, I was told to keep your phone on and keep it next to your bed. Don't be surprised if you get a call at 2:00 in the morning. Sure as shit. Sure enough, Vince is in a meeting and a question about a format. We had actually worked. I'm going to make this quick. We had worked all day, and in typical Vince fashion, our 7:00 p.m. meeting started at about 2 a.m, and we went till about 5 a.m. And I had to get up and jump on a plane to catch a flight in a matter of hours. So I went home. I got a few minutes sleep, or I tried to. It's one of those sleeps when you start falling asleep, you feel like you're falling off a cliff. I'm just going, I'm going out. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, Vince calls and he's, got a question about the fourth segment. Who's in that? And I was like, fuck. I said, Vince, I don't know. I'll call you back, man. You're going to give me a minute. So, yeah, that was Vince was bizarre that way. He worked out in the middle of the night. Half the time when we'd have a meeting set up for 7 and it'd get pushed back here, we'd start a meeting. We'd maybe into the meeting for an hour and a half and 2 hours. All right, guys, we'll be back in a couple hours going down to the gym. Okay. We'd sit around, twiddle our thumbs, or try to prep for when he came back. Sit in the office till 2 o'clock in the morning while Vince is downstairs throwing weights around the room. That was Vince, though. It worked for him.
Stadman Steve wants to know, hey guys, wondering, does Vince ever go in the WWE Hall of Fame? I'd say negative, Ghost Rider. What say you, Eric?
Don't see it. Don't see it.
If it does happen, maybe posthumously. Chase Wolf says, from a video editor with documentary work in the WWE library, what do you think the finish will be? Double cross, bait and switch, reverse double cross, swerve, heat, or something else? Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard about the finish. Doc, is this on your radar? Do you know anything about the finish?
No, that's not on my radar at all.
I think maybe he's proposing this as an idea.
Oh, I see.
Could be. I mean, kind of interesting when you think about it. There's a project. We should go
B40, B40. Well, I think you did that. Any chance of Eric sharing videos of his kickboxing fights here on the channel and talking about the matches? Do you know where we could find footage of you kicking dudes' heads off?
ESPN, maybe in their library somewhere, if they can still have it.
We got to hit them up.
The stuff that back then, we're talking about late 70s, early 80s. So technology wasn't quite there yet. We had video cameras, but they were like, half-inch, big cassettes, and those have all deteriorated and turned to dust. But I think, ESPN, I fought a couple times on ESPN. So if there's a library footage somewhere, then that's about the only place. If I can get my hands on it, it'd be kind of fun to watch.
Do you think you could, through a connection somewhere, figure out what the dates were of those fights? Because if we could figure that out, we could float it up to ESPN.
Yeah, I could figure it out. Sonny probably knows.
Man, wouldn't that be wild to see Eric Bischoff kickboxing? Sign me up.
That'd be a lot of fun.
John Thompson says, question for Eric. Do you believe Vince should have had a representative to speak to him? For example, the incident with Bob Costas. We didn't spend any time talking about that, but they did talk about that Bob Costas interview and how heated it got. That was all during the XFL days. They did it again. They meet years later and do another interview and almost joke about how sideways that one got. It's crazy to think, to me, Eric, that WWE allowed him to go sit with Bob Costas and he didn't have a quote-unquote handler. Are you surprised by that?
No, because who's going to tell him no?
Okay.
No, I'm not surprised. Maybe they wanted to. Maybe somebody suggested it, but are you kidding me?
Brian wants to know a question that only you can answer, Eric. How do you feel you were portrayed and treated in the documentary?
I was ambivalent to it, partly because all the interview that I did in that documentary had nothing to do with the Vince McMahon documentary. It was interview footage from the NWO story or whatever. It had nothing to do with this. So I think it was interesting. I think it provided some context and juxtaposition, but I don't think it really mattered too much, to be honest. Just kind of helped tell the story and provide context.
Last question here from John Thompson. If Shane's purchase of the UFC would have actually happened, what do you think would have been the future of the WWE at that time? Like, how different does the landscape look? I mean, obviously we know, Eric, that Vince didn't co-sign the idea with Shane, and the UFC wound up selling to Endeavor for $4 billion, and then eventually Endeavor merged with WWE. So it was a twisted road that got us here. But in an alternate universe, if we had to just sort of play that through, Shane McMahon gets control of the UFC. What looks different today, do you think?
I don't think there is a UFC, no offense to Shane, but Dana White is a Vince McMahon type of character in the sense, slow down, Dana, in the sense that he's just singularly focused and driven and intense. There's a lot of similarities between those two guys when you hear them talk about business and their views of the world and who they are, the way they think. The Fertitta brothers lost a shit ton of money on UFC before they finally figured it out, and it turned a corner. I think if Shane would have purchased UFC, first thing that would have happened is that Vince would have gotten involved, and it would have looked like an entirely different product. He would have tried to apply a wrestling formula in some respects to the UFC, and I don't think that would have worked. Dana White would have probably not come along. Perhaps he would have, but likely not. And the Fertitta brothers wouldn't have come along. So that means Vince was going to be losing 15, 20 million, $30 million a year on the UFC until it finally turned a corner for what, 5, 6, 7 years? I don't see it. I don't think it would have been. I don't think Shane's version of the UFC, not because of any fault of Shane's, but I think it would have become another Vince property.
I want to do one last comment here, a question. It leads me to a question. Chase Wolf, who just asked the question about the documentary called The Finish. Hey, we all overthought it. That's what they called episode 6. So I didn't realize that. So, but that's what they named episode 6. But Dockins, I wanted to ask you this because, and you and I have not talked about this, so I apologize for putting you on the spot here. But he agreed to this in 2019, this documentary. They started setting up some of these interviews and stuff in 20. Of course, we know the pandemic happened. So it wound up filming started, I believe, in 2021. And we know that the lawsuit that was leaked and filed, not filed, but there was a whisper campaign that started in the Wall Street Journal in the summer of 2022. I'm curious, between 2019 and 2022, I'm sure that Bill Simmons and the crew had a lot of access to WWE footage and archives. But do you think there's a chance that when they saw a storm of brewing, beyond Owen Hart, beyond Sable, beyond the Ring Boys, beyond steroids, but a current pressing matter, not one in the rearview mirror, but now one in the windshield, is it plausible? I mean, I haven't even heard this allegation, but it does feel like WWE may have been a little more difficult to deal with at that point with regards to getting access to this archive or that footage. Maybe they slow rolled it, as I like to say in Conrad speak. Would it surprise you to hear that maybe WWE wanted to pump the brakes on this project once they realized Vince was in trouble present day?
No, it wouldn't surprise me at all, because anything that WWE has, particularly because they've been implicated or potentially other executives have been implicated, is going to be discoverable. They're going to have records subpoenaed. Bill Simmons might get subpoenas for whatever footage they might have. So no, not at all. I wouldn't be surprised if they went from, hey, we're all friends, arm in arm, making this fun documentary about Vince, maybe telling a little more truth about Vince and his upbringing and the motivation behind some of these things he did, to now it's, as people are calling it, a hit piece. I don't know necessarily that's what it is, but I'm sure it went from being buddy-buddy to confrontational with them.
I can't wait for us to talk about episode 6. I had a blast talking about episode 5 with you today, Mr. Dockins. Thank you so much for all the time. If anyone listening to this needs to sue a motherfucker or trademark something, or they got a patent that they need to proceed with, how can they reach you and get in touch with you for your services?
Yeah, the socials are at Gimmick Attorney. And if you go to gimmickattorney.com, it takes you right to the Shoemaker Lupin Kendrick bio of yours truly.
And you can see all those action figures behind him. He represents half of wrestling. So there's your social proof in the background. Eric, any last words as we're wrapping up and putting a button on our recap of episode 5 today of the Mr. McMahon documentary?
I'm sitting here looking at my dog who's begging me to wrap this up so I can take her out for a hike. I just want to thank Mike for joining us. Added a lot of depth and some great perspective in this episode. Look forward to it tomorrow. And I'm actually really looking forward to tomorrow's episode. It's going to be interesting, and I'm interested to hear everybody's observations at the end of 6. So thank you, Doc. Thank you, Conrad.
Thanks for having me, buddy.
Thank you, Super Dave. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. And talk to you tomorrow, bud.
We'll see you tomorrow right here at 83weeks.com. Tell your friends we're live and taking your questions Eric Bischoff, gimmick attorney Mike Dockins, and myself at 83weeks.com tomorrow, Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you there talking all things Mr. McMahon, episode 6.